Good afternoon. Good afternoon to all of you, dear participants and dear panel members for this session on port on the front line of climate change and the potential of PPP to strengthen the resilience of ports. My name is Frida Youssef, and I will be the moderator of this session. I am the Chief of Transport Section in the Trade Logistics branch of UNCTAD. And for those who are not, and I'm also member of the WAPPP Port Chapter Committee. For those who are not familiar with UNCTAD, UNCTAD is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and it is the focal point within the UN system for the integrated treatment of trade and development and interrelated issues such as investment, finance, sustainability, technology, and transport, of course. So indeed, the over theme of the Annual Congress of WAPPP this year is about COP27 and beyond. And ports, we cannot talk about climate change without really looking at the issues of ports. Ports are the keynotes of the global economy interlinkages and supply chain, and any disruption at the port will have an impact across the global economy and as well as the supply chains. When we know that more than 80% of world goods in volume are transported by sea. At the same time, ports are their location, I would say, makes them even more vulnerable to climate risks and extreme weather events. But at the same time, we see that ports are not really integrating, or there are, but not enough, I would say, these climate risk factors. You know, they're not being considered properly when we look at how to, to assess climate risk, how to mitigate, or what measures need to be put in place to improve adaptation and resilience of ports. Therefore, we will try through this session that we have, 1 hour session that we have, to look into these elements, but more specifically how these elements could be integrated into PPPs, because PPPs are really growing and playing an important role in the context of port development, rehabilitation, management of infrastructure and facilities. Nevertheless, we see also that PPPs are not factoring in all these different elements when they do all these different assessments for climate, for risks, including the climate risk. So we hope through this session, we'll try to look at what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, and how to develop, in a way, the long-term climate resilience and sustainability of ports when developing and implementing PPPs projects in ports. So this is, in a nutshell, the introduction of the session. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our first panel member of this event. We will have 4 speakers for this session. And without further ado, I would like to introduce my colleague, Regina Asariotis, who is the Chief of the Policy and Legislation Section in the Division of Technology and Logistics of UNCTAD. And her work focuses on transport and trade law and policies. However, since 2018, Regina has been looking and dedicating a lot of attention and work on the issue of climate change implication for international maritime transport and trade, with a focus on climate change impact and adaptation for seaports and other critical transport infrastructure, including in SIDS. And before joining UNCTAD in 2001, Regina was a senior lecturer in maritime law at the University of Southampton, where she taught for more than 10 years. Regina, I hand you the floor.
Thank you very much, Frida, and thank you very much for the invitation, for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sorry, Regina, before I start, sorry, I forgot to mention to the participants, I would like to just remind them that we have the Q&A box where they could put their questions in the Q&A box at the right hand of the screen, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of this event. Thank you very much.
So can you hear me? Can you see me? I'm starting to share my screen. I hope this is working well. Let me just jump right in because we don't have a lot of time here and there is so much to talk about. So climate change adaptation for seaports, key challenges and approaches. I'm going to kick this off. And just to mention, this is a topic, Frida has already given you a bit of background, we've been working on since 2008, not 18. So this has been occupying us for a long time. We've done a lot of work. I've included that on the last slide if you want to have a look at your leisure later. But let's get going. So first, hang on, can you see the first slide? Seaports are critical. Frida has mentioned this, but this is in a nutshell here on this slide. Over 80% of the volume of global trade is carried by sea from port to ports. So this means we are really interconnected, closely interconnected in this globalized world, and there is no them and us, as it will. So the climate change implications have to be addressed for the benefit of the system as a whole, if you will. Of particular importance is, of course, sea level rise, but also changes in temperature, humidity, precipitation, and extreme storms and floods under climate change are likely to have direct and indirect impacts. So the direct impacts are on port infrastructure, but also on operations, and that the knock-on effects through the supply chain, which will entail potentially not only extensive damage, but also very costly delay and disruption, and also exacerbate other transport-related challenges, including for small island developing states. I can't read all my slides here. Let me just blow this up. Maybe it works. Yes, that's better. In the light of this, climate change adaptation and resilience building for ports is of strategic economic importance, especially given the growing hazards. And this is detailed in a short note on this published last year. So when we're looking at the type of impacts, there are many, and this table just gives you an overview of some of the key impacts by different hazards. So there is mean and extreme sea levels, there's precipitation, temperature extremes, again, meaning different things for different parts of the world, and also wind. If we want to prepare for these impacts, and if we want to address these, we have to first assess them. We have to know where the risks are, how important they are, so that we can set priorities for adaptation action. In this context, when we're talking about risk, we have to bear in mind that risk here in this context is a function of three factors. It's the hazards, the exposure, and the vulnerability. So hazards are climate factors, which in turn depend on emissions and emission scenarios. Exposure of port infrastructure, operations, people to these hazards, and vulnerability, which in turn depends on the capacity to respond to factors that make ports prone to damage or losses. So that includes technologies, materials, port defenses, elevation, human and financial resources, and also governance tools, policy, legislation, and management. So this is very important. If one of these factors goes up, the risk will increase unless we reduce somewhere else. So about hazards, we can't do an awful lot on the adaptation side. Of course, on the emission side, we can, but exposure and vulnerability are therefore particularly important areas. If we're looking at the hazards that are ahead, these are really quite daunting. What you see on this slide are some hazard projections, which we did together in collaboration with the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, where we looked at around 3,700 global ports and looked at the projected changes in the return period of what used to be the 1 in 100 years extreme sea level event. So this is the kind of 1 in 100 years sea level event is the kind of key design parameter for port construction, because you want to make sure the port is fit to withstand that type of event. But the return period, the frequency of this type of intensity is likely to change. So on the top panel, you can see under 1.5 degrees warming, which we expect as soon as 2030. So that's practically next Wednesday. It's at the end of this decade. You can see that even at this level, the return period, red is not good on this slide, even under this scenario, the return periods will decrease to about 1 to 10 to every 1 to 10 years in many South American, African, Gulf states, and Southeast Asian and Pacific ports. Under additional global heating, of course, the situation is going to get worse, and under 3 degrees warming, which could be unfortunately the case towards the end of the century, many ports will experience what used to be a 1 in 100 years event several times per year. This is, of course, deeply troubling. Now, this is not the only type of hazard, and of course, time doesn't permit us to go into great detail, but I think heat is also particularly worth mentioning. You will have seen in the news at the moment, a third of the US population has been told to stay indoors because of extreme heat. The same exercise here on these panels, the same projections for extreme heat events, and we can see that even under 1.5 degree scenario, the return period of the 1 in 100 years extreme heat event will decrease down to every 1 to 5 years in most tropical and subtropical settings. And under 3 degrees, most global ports would experience the baseline event at least every 2 years. That has very important implications for health and safety, because this can be literally a threat to human life, but also for energy needs and costs. We've got some data from some work we did in the Caribbean on this, identifying the increased number of days where energy needs will rise 4% in line with the projection. So this is important in the current climate particularly. And it also goes to show that investment in energy efficiency, renewables, and decarbonization has important co-benefits also for adaptation purposes. Once we know the hazards, we still don't know what this does in situ in any one location. For that, we need to assess the exposure. That has to be done. It has to be understood, and it has to be addressed at facility level. We did some work as part of a technical assistance project, which focused on 8 ports and airports on 2 Caribbean islands, namely Jamaica and St. Lucia. And here you can see panels reflecting some of the results for St. Lucia. Here, under, again, different scenarios, flooding is extensive, and all of the international transport assets, all ports and airports in this particular country are at high risk of coastal flooding under all scenarios. So we need a lot more information of this sort for the specific port in question to be able to prepare effectively and to avoid maladaptation as well, because you cannot just build a wall here or there and then hope for the best. This has to be done with care to achieve the intended effect. The question is, how prepared are we? And I've put this slide up here for you to see the importance of timeframes. We all know that infrastructure takes a long time to plan, and the intended lifespan is even longer. So we have to, as it were, think ahead to prepare ports to the impacts of a changing climate over time. And there is really no time to lose. How prepared are we? We did a port industry survey a few years ago, which suggested that many ports had already suffered important impacts, but felt they lacked the important needed information to adapt properly. And similar results are reflected in a more recent PPPs survey. PPPs is the World Association of Waterborne Infrastructure, which is to be published very soon. So there is a real issue here. On this slide, I have just put together for you key points that sort of emerge from our work over the years. And I've related this to the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action Pathways. This is a work which has been going on since 2019, and we've contributed to that. And the latest revision, the 2021 revision, which is available through the links here, makes it clear that it is important to prepare ahead of time. So there are a number. Frida, could you just switch off your microphone, please? Thank you. There are a number of recommendations in there for different stakeholders, and I'd recommend you have a look at this when time allows. But in addition, they have established some milestones. So according to these milestones, ideally, new transport infrastructure will be climate resistant by 2025 with a view to 2050 standards. And critical transport infrastructure, all critical transport infrastructure should be climate resilient to 2050 by 2030. This, to achieve this resilience, is going to be key to achieving progress on many of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that includes 1.5, which deals with poverty elimination, but also 9, which deals with infrastructure, 13 with climate change, and 14, which deals with oceans economy. What do we need? We need, above all, at this particular point, high quality risk and vulnerability assessments based on best available science and data to improve the understanding of the impacts and guide effective adaptation responses and prioritize the use of resources. This is absolutely critical and there's no time to lose. For this purpose, we need better data, planning early, and adopting a systems approach to avoid maladaptation and or over-engineering. This is very important. We think that mainstreaming is absolutely critical of these considerations into all ordinary planning and operational processes, and that technical studies need support to inform evidence-based priorities, policies, plans, and action. For developing countries in particular, increased capacity building that includes human resource, but also better access to affordable climate finance is going to be critical. And on this, just a very brief comment, you will hear certainly more in the session following my presentation. But at the moment, adaptation finance is still very much lagging. OECD estimates that for 2019, only $20 billion have been made available for adaptation finance. And much of this is still in the form of loans rather than grants, which for developing countries in particular is particularly problematic because they already face growing debt burdens, and they're at the forefront of some of these impacts and need to prepare while lacking capacity. So this is absolutely critical. Ecosystems approaches to adaptation are an important parameter and should be part of any future strategy. There are other elements which are important, and that includes legal, regulatory, and policy frameworks. On this, in this respect, there have been some developments. I'm going to tell you about this in a minute. But let me also say something about standards, guidance, and methodological tools, which are required for stakeholders on the ground. So ISO has produced 2 standards. They are accessible through the links, one on adaptation and one on vulnerability assessments. PIANC, which I've mentioned, have issued detailed guidance on port adaptation. And this year, just very recently, have issued a technical note, which is very, very valuable to guide stakeholders on the ground. And UNCTAD has produced a methodology as part of our work in the Caribbean. Very important is to integrate these considerations into national adaptation plans and NDCs, but also more generally across sectors into development, DRR, and COVID recovery policies and planning. Some recent relevant policy and legal developments are really worth noting here, and this is particularly at the EU level. There is a new EU strategy on adaptation to climate change, which highlights the importance of infrastructure resilience and relevant actions. And here I have on this slide a few legal instruments. That is the Flood Risk Directive, which now requires taking into account the impacts of climate change, but also a number of proposed legal instruments, a directive on resilience of critical entities, and new guidelines for the European TEN-T networks. These envisage climate proofing, and on this, it's important to know that a new EU climate law was adopted last year, and that is in force for all EU member states since the end of July last year, which among others also includes a separate provision on adaptation, which requires best endeavor, but also related monitoring and reporting. So this is going to be very important to follow. And the Environmental Impacts Assessment Directive, which is of course relevant to all port infrastructure planning, and also to EU funding in this regard. That also requires vulnerability to climate change to be taken into account. And on this, on how to do this, important technical guidance has been issued by the Commission, again last year, and this is accessible through this link, which details, for the purposes of infrastructure funding and environmental impact assessment, the specific steps to take. This is 92 pages long, so you can imagine there's a lot of detail in there. And that is, I think, going to be extremely useful on the ground to take this forward. But it will also mean that in financing, in public-private partnerships, in financing any of these efforts, there will be these types of issues will have to be taken into account.
Regina, please, we have to, we're running out of time. Please, if you can, key messages.
This is my last slide. So in a nutshell, seaports are critical. SIDS particularly depend on them. The risk of climate change impacts is important and it is growing. There is a significant cost of inaction, and failure to adapt is not an option, really. So time is of the essence. And for this meeting in particular, I would just say major scaling up of capacity building and investment is critical for developing countries. And that needs to be, among others, also more in the form of grants rather than loans. So with that, I'm going to leave it here. You have a slide with some further work if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Regina. Thank you for reiterating the importance of climate change resilience to ports and what needs to be done, and all the recent developments that have been developments research that has been done, including also the measures that have been put in place, including the EU. So without further ado, now we move to our next speaker, who would try to also explain now how to factor in all these different risks that Regina was mentioning when we look at PPP development in ports. What are the challenges, and how, or what is happening, and what needs to be done further. And with that, I'm very happy to invite David Wigner, who is the Senior Port Advisor and also WAPPP Chapter Committee. David is a senior port professional. His expertise stretched from economic and feasibility through day-to-day operation. He has been responsible for directing research and consulting studies and providing management support for marine assets through the world. In his current role, he provides port consultancy, focusing on technical, operational, economic advice and support to governments, port terminals worldwide. David, you have the floor.
Many thanks, Frida. Good afternoon, and can I thank WAPP for the opportunity to speak a little about the potential for building ports, climate resilience and sustainability. 10 minutes isn't long enough to cover the subject in any depth, and even if I tried to take a lot longer, I'd still be very limited in what I could say. So what I've decided to do is just advance 6 general areas of potential by using placeholders, sort of ideas and thoughts about the main areas that I see that the impact that climate change is going to have, in particular on ports and through PPPs. So I'm just going to go through 6 general areas as placeholders. First of all, referring exactly what Regina has just been talking about, sea level rise, how high the water is. But it's, as Regina said, it's really a placeholder for a broader range of climatic changes that have a long-term impact on the physical design criteria. You cannot limit it to just sea level rise, not least because even flooding doesn't just come from increasing the sea level. It comes from as much from runoff from the hinterland and areas like that. So the real place here and the real concept is making sure you got your design criteria correct. And as Regina's just been mentioning, making sure that the appropriate risk balances are being undertaken and that the risk reviews are being undertaken, so you get a very good understanding of the new design criteria that are going to be need to apply. The slight concern is that simply just raising quay level on a port doesn't solve all your problems and can in fact introduce problems to you. If you move up your quay level by half a meter, you can find yourself spending an awful lot more energy and an awful lot more time unloading the cargoes for most of the time. So need to be careful as we come up with those new design criteria. So sea level is a placeholder for making sure you've got your design criteria right, and then you implement them through the designs and the planning and designs that you're undertaking in the port itself. And okay, I've used here some of the work we've been doing recently on the responses to specific disasters, and in this case, an earthquake and a tsunami in Palu, and it gives you some ideas of the areas where design may have to change. You know, we can go through this. We'll ignore the bits on earthquake, but go to the need to design high but relatively open areas for safe assembly in the case of a tsunami. Those need to be planned into the overall approach. You need to understand where you are going to get to in extreme conditions, how you get there, and even the ability to get there in the times of a tsunami needs to be designed in, making sure you've got wide, safe accesses into specific buildings and staircases that are able to take you up to the right level to survive. And this is part of understanding how design goes and implements as the design criteria changes and the nature of what you have to plan for changes. And in line with that, you also need to make sure it's actually constructed properly. Now, design and construction, to me as a long-time engineer, these are things that you always should have been doing anyhow, but the critical thing is to make sure you have reviewed those design criteria, you have the right design criteria in place, and they're actually being implemented in practice during construction. So moving on, fishing is the second placeholder I've put in, and that's really a placeholder for managing maritime resources, a wide range of different maritime resources. The port itself acts as the node, the place where it can be implemented in reality. So whether that's fish or seabed minerals or offshore wind, these are things that the port has a very important place in supporting and controlling. I chose fish as the placeholder in this case because I can use it as a very specific example of a PPP that is being prepared, looking at how PPP can be placed in the fishing sector. Now, fish is important in terms of income, in terms of protein, but it is not an unlimited resource, and it's a resource that is under incredibly great pressure from overfishing in many areas. And so the ability to control the level of fishing is important, making sure that people are not taking out more fish, making sure that it's not being taken illegally, and more importantly, perhaps improving the quality of how it's taken, when it's taken and stored to reduce the losses. Many fishing grounds are subject to very high losses between catch and delivery to the table, and eliminating those is a very good way of improving the quality of use of the resource. It has to be said quite consistently, there are not enough fish in the sea, and we can't keep taking more fish from the sea. But we can improve what we do with that fish as we take it from the sea. So this PPP has the private sector providing better fishing boats, using lower temperatures to freeze it to, improving the quality and reducing the damages of the fish presented to the market, and and also helping with providing surveillance, and then the government managing the quotas and providing the quota direct into the private sector, giving a formal control and process through which fishing stocks can be managed. Now, moving on, we see into energy consumption, and I'm going to leave that because I know Piotr could probably speak for several hours on energy consumption and its importance within port concessions. So I'm going to pass quickly on and just talk about bunkering, how ports need to support and assist the shipping community in its move to new fuels. Now, a few years ago, everyone was talking about LNG and the move to LNG bunkering, but these days it's still a carbon emitter, and people want to go further into hydrogen, blue or green sourced hydrogen, or use methanol as an alternative fuel, possibly even ammonia as a fuel. And some have even sort of started the idea of, well, nuclear is the ultimate answer to the fuel problems. From the point of view of a port, all of these need to be supported, but actually supporting them all requires a huge amount of land and is extremely difficult. So it becomes very difficult, and they all require substantial investment to support them. It's a natural for a PPP bunkering hub for LNG or hydrogen or methanol, but the port then has a problem. Which one is going to be the most successful? Which one is going to become the dominant fuel? And attracting PPP in this circumstance becomes very difficult, because if you invest heavily in hydrogen and you find out ammonia is going to win, it adds another level of complexity to the private sector's assessment and calculation problems. So, vital part of the response to reducing emissions and trying to get a handle on climate change, but the ports have not enough space, and the PPP cases for implementing each one of these is quite difficult in competition. So it's an area that needs very great care and attention when we look at it going forward. That then allows us to move on to the last area, which is natural disasters and the increasing natural disasters. Regina and Frida both made the point that the ports are key nodes in the overall transport chain. And it's vital that ports, first of all, can respond and recover from disaster as soon as practical themselves, not least for their own benefit, but that they are the enablers of recovery in the rest of their community. The port has to recover first so that the food, the equipment, and the supplies can come in to help the rest of the area recover. And just sort of commenting on this, it's a good area for PPP. The ability to respond is something that can be provided through PP, and we've seen PPPs in that sector do very well. But in some of the responses we've seen, returning to Palu, it came at the end of a sequence of disasters, and the resources were very depleted. And so understanding and using PPP as a way of restoring the resources available and making sure the resources are maintained is a clear and possible way forward that can be used and can be encouraged. And that's where it's very, very important to consider how we can do this moving forward. And at that point, I will hand back to Frida, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, David, for setting these 6 major areas that need to be considered when we look at PPP. It's not only about also the infrastructure and the design and managing the infrastructure, but also it's about the operation side and about energy. They need to also look at energy, need to manage resources, and as well as the responsive mechanisms also to disasters. So building resilience and how to also respond to that is key. For that, now we'll move to the third theme of the session, and that is about finance. We heard it also from Regina about the importance of financing adaptation and resilience in ports. And for that, we're very happy to invite Sarah Duff from EBRD. She is the Principal Climate Strategy and Delivery at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD. Sarah is the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Expert at the EBRD. As a principal in the EBRD Climate Strategy and Delivery Department, she works to scale up EBRD adaptation finance, supporting clients in assessing and managing physical climate risk and integrating climate resilience into infrastructure asset networks and operation. So Sarah, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Frida. I don't have any slides to share. I'm just going to sort of speak a bit around the topic of financing climate resilience and port specifically. My name is Sarah Duff. I'm from the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. And EBRD is a multilateral development bank which has a private sector focus. So I think it's really relevant here when we talk about PPPs in the private sector and financing and climate resilience, it really fits quite well with our entire mandate as a bank. We have a transition mandate at EBRD. In the countries that we work in our countries of operation, we aim to support them in transitioning to a market economy. And as part of that, we look at how our countries can transition to a green economy transition. So we have a big focus when it comes to climate. We have a target to invest at least 50% of our investments, of our business volume, into green investments. So that is climate mitigation, low carbon, climate adaptation and resilience, and other environmental opportunities and investments. So we have a big focus when it comes to financing climate resilience. We also, as with any other, all the other joint multilateral development banks, have a commitment to align all of our operations with the Paris Agreement and the goals of the Paris Agreement. So that means that we will make sure that we're investing in low carbon and climate resilient development, and we won't be investing any longer in things which undermine climate resilience. So that is really our baseline when it comes to making sure that we ensure that all of our operations are resilient and low carbon. We also go further in terms of the investment and the 50% target that I mentioned earlier. So we've been investing in climate resilience and climate adaptation since 2011. It's been part of our, what we call the GET approach, the Green Economy Transition approach. And in the last 10 years, we've done over 350 climate resilience projects. And obviously, as there is such a need for financing when it comes to climate adaptation and providing more finance, we obviously aim to scale up those amounts and deliver more when it comes in terms of the finance. And that's why, together with our private sector focus, we aim to crowd in the private sector into the financing of these types of investments. We see very much the need for, obviously, grants, as Wigner mentioned earlier, and we think that alone is not going to be enough to meet the demands of what is needed in terms of climate resilience. So we also have this aim to bring in the private sector as much as possible. And PPPs are one of the ways that we see that can be done. So we've done a lot of work with PPPs generally, and also with climate resilience and PPPs, working with the Global Center on Adaptation and helping them to develop the climate resilient infrastructure officers training that they prepared last year, I think it was, and also taking part into some of their trainings to those climate resilient infrastructure officers to look at how we can develop together innovative financing solutions. We also sort of generally work together with the port community and have been involved in the PPP guidance that was mentioned earlier about making port infrastructure more climate resilient. Because together with our financing, we also provide this sort of wider policy engagement with our countries of operation and technical cooperation in sort of developing the projects, but also developing the capacity building and the thinking around climate resilience and around sort of how projects can be developed and how systems can function better. So I think ports are a really good example of the types of projects that we actually do, because when it comes to understanding what is actually a climate adaptation or climate resilience project, the process that we follow, it follows the same method that was talked about earlier in terms of risk assessment, of understanding first what is the context of climate vulnerability that needs to be addressed, and then what actions are going to be taken, how does this impact on the infrastructure, on the network, on the investment that we're investing in, and what are the actions that need to be taken in order to mitigate that, to respond to that, and how is our financing then linked to that. And we look at, when we're financing these investments, we look at what the impact of our finance is, and how the project and the investment results in quantifiable outcomes. So in the port sector, what we're looking at there is how an investment in a more climate resilient port infrastructure can reduce the amount of damage caused by extreme weather events and climate change, and reduce the amount of disruption to the network. So with ports being such a critical node in a transport infrastructure network, this is a really good example of how if we improve the resilience of that port infrastructure, it not only reduces the amount of damage to the port itself, but it also reduces disruption on the network, because ports are so crucial for the wider economy. So and obviously with them being so at risk and so vulnerable from the impacts of sea level rise and of increased wave energy, there's a lot that can be done in the port sector to ensure that they are made more resilient, and then the impacts and the benefits of that are very widespread. When it comes to some project examples of the things that we've done, we have been working on port projects for quite a while. One of our most recent investments is with the National Port Authority of Morocco, so the Agence Nationale du Port, and we provided a 40 million euro loan to support climate resilient investments in 6 ports across the network of the ANP's priority investment program. As well as, together with the loan that we provided, we also used that loan to facilitate getting a grant from the Special Climate Change Fund managed by the GEF. So the work that we do with ANP, it'll be implemented now, and it involves investments such as breakwaters and improvements to the quays, as David mentioned. But it also includes a very large capacity building program. So working with the Port Authority to help them implement the recommendations from the PIANC, the PIANC guidance on climate change adaptation for ports and navigation infrastructure, and to use that in their operations and how they function and how they manage their climate risks going forward, and how they train up members of staff members throughout the entire organization. So that project, it's underway now. It was just signed last month at our annual conference in Morocco, and it's just the latest example really of a number of different port projects that we've done. We've worked also with the port of Gdansk and also other ports across the Mediterranean region, and the areas obviously that the countries of operation that we invest in. As well as the financing of port projects, we also have a project preparation unit, a PPP unit within EBRD, who sit in a sort of separate part of the bank, who prepare PPPs and work with ports, but also other developers to help them prepare the PPP process, and then we may or may not finance those projects once they get developed. But the team are obviously very well aware of the risks of climate change, because especially for projects like PPPs that are so they take a long time to prepare and to have an understanding of the legislation changes that might come into place in the future, but also the physical changes to the climate that are going to happen by the time that the project is eventually implemented. So ports, I think, are one of the best examples of where really long-lived infrastructure assets need to be thinking about the climate change over the entire lifetime of the investment and the entire lifetime of how long that port is going to be operating. So having an awareness of those issues now is utmost importance. And from my side, I think that's it, and I can answer any questions anybody has.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you for reiterating the importance of integrating all these risks when assessing PPP projects in port or any other project in port, and given the long-term cycle of ports. So and the financing mechanisms as well, and more specifically the ANP project that EBRD is financing in this regard in Morocco. Thank you very much. With that, we will come to our last speaker. I know that we're running ahead of time. We still have 45 minutes, but we'll make it on time. So with this, we're very happy to have with us Piotr Konopka. I hope I spelled your name right, from DP World. So Piotr is a Senior Manager of Energy and Decarbonization Program at DP World. He oversees global portfolio of projects across equipment electrification, process efficiency, renewable energy, low carbon fuel, and carbon compensation. He is experienced strategy consultant and sustainable energy engineer. So Piotr, you have the floor, and you will give us now the perspective or the experience from a terminal on how climate risk is managed, assessed, and the role of PPPs. Thank you very much. Piotr, you can... I can't see you. Yeah, you're there.
I hope you can see me. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much,
Yes.
Frida. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, and warm greetings from sunny Dubai. Before I jump into the topic, I just wanted to say a few words about DP World itself. We're a global ports and terminals operator, of course, but an increasingly large player also in parks and economic zones, logistics, and marine services sector. We have over 150 operating entities with operational control over 50 of these are ports, really in all sorts of geographical locations, which poses an interesting challenge, both from decarbonization and from the adaptation side, given the intrinsic characteristics of each of the regions or in each of the locations that we operate in. So, as Frida mentioned, my role at DP World is to manage our global energy and decarbonization programs. And when thinking about energy and decarbonization programs, there are really two major work streams that we are working on at DP World. The first one is climate change mitigation. That is when we talk about our net zero carbon targets and our decarbonization strategy, including action plans. And then the second work stream is the climate change adaptation part, which is, in many cases more short term, as we already see the impact of climate change on our operations today. We're looking at minimizing business disruption. We are assessing risks, and we're ensuring that our engineering assets are resilient to these climate change impacts that we're seeing today, and we're going to be expecting to see more of in the future. So, starting off with our climate change mitigation plans, we have completed our decarbonization strategy back in 2019. That is also when we have set our baseline, our short and long-term targets towards net zero carbon and our decarbonization pillars. We have 5 decarbonization pillars, and these are the kind of usual suspects, right? Equipment electrification, process efficiency, renewable energy supply, low carbon fuel supply, and carbon compensation. When we talk about PPPs, I would say the first 2 pillars of this strategy are more about simply partnerships with OEMs on research and development and making sure that we can realize our plans around equipment electrification and efficiency. But renewable energy supply, low carbon fuel supply, and carbon compensation are really much broader topics that do require quite a lot of collaboration across the industry. Renewable energy supply in particular requires collaboration with local authorities, technology providers, financing bodies, and even more so in geographies such as Africa, some parts of Asia or South America, where it's really not as easy as it is in Europe to supply your renewable energy. That is basically a phone call away from your utility provider, and switching to a green tariff. You really need to push and develop these assets yourself if you want to have renewable electricity supply in our ports. Low carbon fuel supply, I think David covered that really well. I think that an important thing to note here is that in majority of the operations around the world, we work under a concession, which basically means we're hired to do a job, which is to move containers. We are not an energy company, or in the majority of the cases, not in the bunkering business, which means that if we would like to introduce new types of fuels, for example, biofuels, maybe hydrogen in the future, or we're going to have ships docking at our ports running on such engines, this does require partnerships within the port authority to allow for such bunkering facilities. That this is really not something that DP World can do on our own. And then carbon compensation. We are not really in the play of purchasing large amounts of carbon credits. We prioritize what's called nature-based solutions, for example, developments of mangroves in and around the coastal areas. So that's, again, something that requires a significant amount of partnerships with local agencies, financing, also kind of seedling providers to realize these large-scale nature-based compensation projects. Moving on to climate change resilience and adaptation. The approach that we take is we first need to understand what are the impacts to our business, assess the risks, set the action plans, and then using those plans target the engagement of relevant stakeholders. And I would say we are still at this stage of assessing what the climate change resilience and adaptation really means for us. But we will very shortly really be moving to actioning these plans that are currently under development. So what does it mean for us when it comes to the assessment of risk there? We started off with a qualitative assessment of local risks. We've issued a set of questionnaires to our operating units around the world, which looked at things like sea level rises, temperature rises, extreme weather events, and whether this is something that they've observed so far, and do they believe that their equipment is capable of withstanding these increased pressures from climate change. That was really the first step. The next step for us was to develop a very comprehensive environmental risk management framework that allows you to really look asset by asset, set thresholds for what's, for example, and you can call it unacceptable wind speed beyond which we have to switch off the operations. But really, that risk management framework is only a nice to have if we don't have quantitative data at a local level to be able to really measure these impacts, right? So once we set the risk thresholds at an asset level, we are currently actually at this stage of working with data providers to really understand, under the different climate change RCP scenarios towards 2100, what are the scenarios for wind speeds, for extreme weather events, for sea level rises, for temperature rises, for really every single one of our locations, which will be running through that risk framework to identify our top assets at risk. Collection of case studies. There's been some interesting case studies. For example, we lost over 50 shifts in our Canadian operating entity because of climate change impacts like flooding. Last year, we're investigating active mooring because we see that we need to increasingly operate under conditions, swell conditions that we would have normally switched the operations off, but there will be more and more, they are going to be more and more persistent. And then we'll move on to action, right? Once we have the plan, it's all about strategic evidence-based planning at an asset level, education of our stakeholders. All of this is really a new topic that we need to do a lot of capacity building internally and externally. Then, of course, identifying partnerships. As I said, this is not something that we can do ourselves. We need a push on port authorities, R&D, regulation, and other players to help us adapt to climate change. And then, last but not least, actual adaptations of infrastructure, really starting with keys all the way to design principles around our on our cranes and other physical assets. So I'll leave it at that. I think my key message here is that mitigation and adaptation to climate change is not something that any company can really solve by themselves. It requires a significant level of collaboration at all sorts of levels, and only then we can really be successful at the global as a global community to mitigate and adapt to these changes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Piotr, for this very well detailed explanation of DP World approach to climate change mitigation adaptation, which go hand in hand when we talk about building resilience of ports. We have 5 minutes left. I think we can take 1 or 2 questions. I see here the IMO has proposed carbon pricing for international maritime. What do you think will be the governance issue for collection and distribution of carbon pricing revenues and allocation? I think I can ask Regina to answer that, but this is more very much what is now the discussion that is happening currently at IMO on the best market-based measure that could apply to support in this regard, and how the revenue that would be generated could be allocated either to the industry or the most vulnerable countries like the states. But I don't know, Regina, if you want to say something about that.
Just very, very quickly, because there's no time here, but at IMO, there are some proposals under discussion, and also the industry has proposed a research and development fund, primarily for research into alternative fuels. At the same time, the European Commission is proposing to expand the European Emissions Trading Scheme to include international shipping, and that's of concern to the industry. So very difficult to say this. I think for future work on the technical side, important that this is not technology driven, but actual research needs are taken into account, and that it's going to be open for researchers on this rather than being technology driven. So this is just a very quick issue, but in any event, there has to be some action on this soon to move forward, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Regina. I see 1 question to Sarah about the EBRD also providing co-finance in relation to purchase of specific assets or group of assets regarding climate adaptation. Example, conversion of yard operation from diesel to electronic yard operation. So anything you want to add to that one, please, Sarah, in terms of the co-financing that is provided?
Yeah, let me just check the question. I think we do provide financing when it comes to either specific assets or groups of assets, but typically we work with a client to understand what it is that they need, and then we structure the project around that. So I guess we don't really, I mean, there's no real specific set we can or cannot provide finance for certain things. I mean, we generally, if the projects or if the investments are kind of aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and if we see an opportunity to focus specifically on certain assets that will support climate adaptation, then of course we want to do that. We want to be able to provide the financing, but we'll also work with the client to understand the broader needs.
Allow me, Frida, please. We need to close this session in 1 minute. There are many questions.
Yeah.
We have this setup is not like a Zoom webinar where when we finish, we finish. It's like a conference. So you can move off the main stage and go outside in the lobby where you can have coffee and chat with the members of the audience if they want to talk to you. So the way to do that, in case the speakers would like to do it and our audience members, is you click on when we terminate this session, you will see on the top of your screen, you have 4 options in the menu. You have reception, you have sessions, you have meet and greet, and booths. You can go to meet and greet, and there's a table labeled WAPPP. You can sit around that table and continue the conversation. You can ask your questions, you can answer them, you can chat, and of course you can visit the booths if you want to. But we'll end it here, and final words to you, Frida.
Yes, thank you, Ziad. Thank you. Well, thank you all. First, thank you, our panel member speakers, for your very insightful intervention. Thank you also for the participants with all these questions. Like Ziad said, we will try to go to the meet and greet the booth, if I understand, and answer the questions. If not by email, you can write to us as well. And one takeaway message I would say here is the importance of capacity building, collecting case studies and best practices, as well as the data issue and collecting data and information in this regard. And I think with WAPP and UNCTAD, this is just the beginning of the work on this area, and we hope we will be able to deliver more on this issue of climate change, PPPs, and port and transport issues. Thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to another activity with you all. Thank you all, and good afternoon.